Hello everyone. In this episode of Beginner Series, we will be discussing on networking and security. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I am Sudhish Narayanaswamy. I work as a Senior PM Manager with Azure Database for MySQL Server. Now let's see what all we will cover in this session today. We will look how we can connect to Azure Database for MySQL using public access and private access, discuss on TLS and SSL, enterprise grade security, compliance, and privacy. We have two options to connect to Azure Database for MySQL Server. One is a public access, usually used for development workloads or smaller workloads, where you filter the connections coming to the service using the firewall rules. The other is the private access, which actually is used by customers, those who need high security and isolation. In public access, we use the public endpoint to connect to Azure Database for MySQL. Whichever IP address is allowed in the firewall rules, those clients can only connect to the service. The service name is publicly resolvable, and the traffic goes through internet pathways, and it is not flowing through the private network. Now, coming to private access, the server is integrated with a VNet. The subnet in which we will be hosting the service on those VNet needs to be delegated to Microsoft DB for MySQL flexible servers. The name resolution is taken care with the help of private DNS zones. The network traffic is completely over the private network and is highly isolated. Now let's check the VNet architecture in detail. In this picture, you can see that we have a subnet 1 under VNet 1, which is delegated for Azure Database for MySQL flexible server. You can host more than one Azure Database for MySQL flexible server under the same delegated VNet. If you're connecting from the same VNet, you can directly connect it to the service. If you're connecting from a different VNet, you have to use VNet pairing. You can either use local pairing or global pairing based on the location of your VNet. For name resolution, we use private DNS zones which gets created, and also the virtual links to link the private DNS zone to the VNet in which your client application in. You can use a network security groups to control the access to the Azure Database for MySQL flexible servers VNet. If you are connecting from on-premises, then you can use either Express Route or VPN to connect to the VNet in which the Azure Database for MySQL Server is hosted. Now let's see how we can create and connect to Azure Database for MySQL Flexible Server with private access and public access. In the Azure portal, once you give the required details in the basic page like the server name, compute queue, version, username, password, etc., you will be taken to the networking page. In the networking page, you will get an option either to choose public or private access. If you are using public access, you would have to also give the firewall rule. This firewall rule, where you can specify a firewall rule name and IP address to make sure that you allow that specific IP address to connect to your server. You can use this allow public access from any network service from Azure to make sure that any services in Azure or any clients which are running in Azure can be allowed to connect to the server. If you are using private access, then you would have to specify the VNet which you have delegated, or you can create a new virtual network and delegate a subnet to Azure Database for MySQL flexible servers. You can also specify the private DNS zone or create a new private DNS zone for the server with the name private.mysql.database.azure.com, which will help you to resolve the name of the server. Once you give these details, you can click next and then do a review create option. Now this is how you can create either a private access server or a public access server. Once the server is created, on the networking pane, you will see whether you have enabled public access or private access. And if you have enabled public access, if you want to add more firewall rules, you can add it up here and then saving that particular firewall rule. Or if you want to delete any IP addresses not to give access to the server, that can also be done here. In case of private access servers, you will see this option as private access. It will give you the details about the VNet and the subnet in which it is hosted, which is the delegated subnet. And then it will also talk about the private DNS zone in which the host entry is recorded. Now, if you go to the VNet, you can find there are two subnets, of which one of the subnet is delegated to Azure Database for MySQL server, right? And this is 172.199.1.0/24 subnet, which is being allocated. Now, if you move to the private DNS zone, which is created for this server, you can see that server name .private.mysql.database.azure.com. You can see a host entry in that particular subnet where an IP address is allocated. This IP address is not static, it can change. So make sure that you use the DNS name resolutions when connecting to the servers. Azure Database for MySQL Server supports client connecting to the service using secure socket layer with TLS encryption. By default, the SSL is on and the TLS version configured is 1.2. There are different configuration you can set for the SSL and TLS from the server parameters pane. The options and how it would behave is detailed in this table below. Now let's check on the enterprise level security, compliance and privacy. All data and backups are encrypted with FIPS 140-2 cryptographic algorithm. All backups are encrypted using AES 256-bit encryption. For the data in motion, we use SSL with TLS. And for network security, we can isolate and make the traffic private using the VNet integration. These are the resources which is there in the description as well, which details on the networking and security principles with Azure Database for MySQL Flexible Server. Thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to write back to us in the email mentioned below.